The red and blue strobes were painting a chaotic, pulsing mural across the ancient oak trees at the edge of my property. It was a bizarre kind of art, flashing violently against the deep, peaceful dark I had come to cherish. 2 police cruisers were parked awkwardly on the gravel path I'd laid, their presence a screaming violation of the silence. It's funny looking back, how a journey toward absolute tranquility could end with the wail of a siren aimed squarely at you. An officer, young and with a jawline tighter than a banjo string, was walking towards my small, newly built cabin, his hand resting casually but pointedly on his sidearm. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not at all. The dream had been a simple one. Born from 2 decades of city life, of concrete canyons and the constant low-grade hum of humanity, I was a software architect, recently retired. My career had been about creating order from digital chaos, building rigid systems that performed flawlessly. But I was done with the order. I craved the messy, unpredictable rhythm of the natural world. I wanted to hear wind in the trees, not a ventilation system. I wanted to see a constellation, not the orange glow of light pollution. I wanted a place to decompress, a place where the only deadline was the sunset. My search had lasted for 6 months, a frustrating parade of overpriced plots with nosy neighbors and postage stamp-sized views. I was about to give up when I stumbled upon it. The listing was a ghost, buried deep on a real estate aggregator, almost 20 years old and seemingly never updated. 15-acre lake reserve, it read. No pictures, just a parcel number and the name of a long-dead realtor. It was a digital forgotten corner, an anomaly. And for someone in my line of work, anomalies were meant to be investigated. I drove out the next day. The location was an hour and a half from the city, tucked away behind a winding country road that the GPS barely recognized. The last mile was a dirt track, overgrown and barely passable. And then it opened up. The land was wild. It wasn't landscaped or manicured. It was a raw, untamed slice of forest, thick with pine and birch and ancient gnarled oaks. It sloped gently down to the star of the show, a pristine glass-surfaced lake that shimmered under the afternoon sun. It was perfect. It was more than perfect. It was a sanctuary. My first call was to a new local realtor. When I gave him the parcel number, there was a long pause. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a mixture of confusion and surprise. "The Hemlock Point Reserve. That hasn't been on the market in my lifetime. The county lists the owner as a defunct timber corporation from the 70s. It's basically a forgotten asset." He warned me that buying a property like this could be a legal nightmare of claims and title disputes. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the adjacent community. "You should know," he'd said. "The land borders the Evergreen Vistas housing development. They're particular." I didn't think much of it. Particular was a word people used for folks who liked tidy lawns. I wasn't planning on having a lawn. The legal process was, as predicted, a slog. I hired the best property lawyer in the state, a man whose glasses were as thick as his reputation. We spent 3 months in a deep dive of due diligence. We did a title search that went back to the original land grants of the 1880s. We had surveyors walk every inch of the 15 acres, their bright orange vests tiny specks of order against the chaos of the woods. We untangled the web of the defunct timber corporation, tracking down its last living descendant, a 90-year-old woman in a nursing home who was thrilled to find she was sitting on a forgotten family asset. Throughout the process, my lawyer, a man named Arthur, kept coming back to one specific part of the original deed. He would put on a second pair of reading glasses and squint at the century-old document, tracing the faded cursive with a fingertip. "This is archaic," he'd muttered during one of our meetings. "The language they used to establish this parcel is absolute. It wasn't just sold as land. It was designated as a nature and waterway reserve. The water rights clause is unlike anything I've seen in modern conveyances. It doesn't just grant you access, it grants you stewardship, control." At the time, it just sounded like poetic legal jargon, a relic of a bygone era. I was buying the land and the lake came with it. That was all that mattered to me. I had no idea that in those faded, spidery letters lay the financial and social equivalent of a tactical nuclear weapon. The day I closed, I didn't go home. I drove straight to my land, my land. The words felt foreign and wonderful. I parked my car on the dirt track and walked through the trees, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. I reached the edge of the lake and just stood there for an hour, watching the water. The opposite shore, maybe a quarter of a mile away, was a different world. That was Evergreen Vistas. Their side was a testament to control. Identical boat docks made of the same composite material, jutted out into the water at precise, evenly spaced intervals. Behind them were massive, cathedral-like houses, each with a perfectly manicured lawn that sloped down to a uniform retaining wall. Not a single tree on their side looked out of place. It was nature, but nature that had been beaten into submission. I saw people out on their docks enjoying the evening. They looked like they belonged in a catalog. Perfect families, perfect homes, perfect life. My side was a tangle of fallen logs, unruly ferns, and the beautiful, messy evidence of a living ecosystem. We were two different worlds, separated by a thin sheet of water. A feeling of profound peace washed over me. Here I was the master of my own wild domain, and they, I assumed, were happy in theirs. We would be neighbors, separated by a beautiful, silent buffer. I had no idea that to them, that water wasn't a buffer. It was their backyard, and they were about to discover a stranger had just bought it. The first few months were pure, unadulterated bliss. It was my decompression phase. I hired a small local crew, a father and son team who specialized in rustic cabins, and we got to work. My dream wasn't a mansion to compete with the behemoths across the lake. It was the opposite. I wanted something small, efficient, and respectful of the land. A one-bedroom cabin with a large, screened-in porch and a single massive stone fireplace. I was on site every day, not as a supervisor, but as an apprentice. I learned how to frame a wall, how to set a post, the satisfying thud of a hammer striking true. The smell of fresh-cut cedar and pine became my new cologne. I worked until my muscles ached in a way they never had sitting at a desk, a good ache that led to deep, dreamless sleep. My mornings were spent with a mug of black coffee on a half-finished porch, watching the mist burn off the lake as the sun climbed over the trees. I saw deer sipping at the water's edge, a family of otters playing on a submerged log, and once, a bald eagle circling high above, its white head a stark beacon against the blue sky. This was my reward. This was the interest payment on a life spent in a cubicle. The folks from Evergreen Vistas were a constant, distant presence. Their motorboats would occasionally zip across the far side of the lake, their laughter and music carrying faintly over the water. They were like a television show playing in another room with the sound turned down. They had their world, I had mine. I figured the construction of my cabin was no secret. The sound of saws and hammers surely carried, but no one ever approached. I assumed they were content to observe from a distance. The first direct contact came in the form of a wicker basket left at the edge of my property, right where the gravel path met the old dirt road. It was filled with shrink-wrapped muffins, a bottle of Chardonnay, and tucked neatly into the side, a thick, spiral-bound booklet. The cover read, Evergreen Vistas Homeowners Association, Community Covenants and Bylaws. I chuckled, tossing the book onto the passenger seat of my truck. A welcome to the neighborhood gift that was 90% instruction manual. Classic. I ate one of the muffins. It was disappointingly dry and didn't give it another thought. The book sat in my truck for a week, collecting dust, a silent, unread harbinger. The day my cabin was finished, the father and son crew packed up their tools, shook my hand, and wished me well. The silence they left behind was profound. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. That evening I celebrated. I built the first fire in my new fireplace, poured myself a healthy measure of whiskey, and sat on my porch as dusk settled. The water was like black silk, reflecting a sky full of stars the city had stolen from me long ago. A speedboat, one of the flashier ones from across the lake, cut across the water much closer to my shore than usual. It slowed, idled for a moment, and then turned and sped back. It felt like a probe, a scout. An hour later, I saw the flicker of a flashlight weaving through my trees. My heart hammered in my chest. I wasn't scared, but a hot spike of anger shot through me. This was a trespass. I grabbed a heavy mag light from my kitchen counter and went out to meet them. I found a man and a woman standing 20 yards from my cabin, staring at it like it was an alien spacecraft. The woman held the flashlight. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an expensive-looking pastel tracksuit. She held herself with an unnerving stillness, a posture of absolute, unshakable authority. This, I would soon learn, was Brenda, the president of the Evergreen Vistas HOA. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. The beam of her flashlight snapped to my face, blinding me for a second. "You're the owner," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," I said, squinting. "And you're on my property." She clicked the flashlight off, and my eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. "We were just taking a look," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of condescension. "There's been a great deal of concern amongst the residents about the construction here. We like to maintain a certain aesthetic, A certain standard, I almost laughed. I assure you my cabin standards are quite high. Though I'm not sure how they're any of your concerns. The man who had been silent until now cleared his throat. He was softer, rounder, and seemed to be perpetually in his wife's shadow. It's just, the lake. It's a community resource, is it? I asked, my voice turning cold. I was under the impression it was part of the 15 acres I purchased. Brenda produced a thin, patronizing smile. The lake has been used by the families of Evergreen Vistas for 20 years. We have docks, we have boats. We have a community fund for water quality and weed control. We are the stewards of this lake. There was that word again. Stewards. But she used it like a weapon, not a responsibility. That's very interesting, I said, my patience evaporating. Because my deed, which has been vetted by some of the best legal minds in the state, says that I am. It says this entire parcel, including the lake it contains, is a privately owned reserve. My reserve. Brenda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. I think you'll find you're mistaken. We have a long-established precedent. Did you receive our welcome basket? The community bylaws are quite clear on waterway usage. Perhaps you should read them. We'll be in touch. She turned, her husband trailing her like a pilot fish, and they disappeared back into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, the whiskey souring in my stomach. The peace had been broken. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. The first thing I did the next morning was brew a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve a spoon, and I sat on my porch with 2 documents. The first was the thick, glossy HOA bylaws booklet. The second was a high-resolution scan of my own deed, which I pulled up on my laptop. I read the bylaws first. It was a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak. 100 pages of meticulously crafted rules designed to legislate every conceivable aspect of a homeowner's life. It dictated the precise shade of beige your house could be painted, the maximum height of a hedge, the approved species of flowers for a window box, and the number of hours a garage door could remain open. There were pages dedicated to holiday decorations, garbage can placement, and the acceptable decibel level for social gatherings. It was a blueprint for a life of quiet, aesthetic conformity. And then I found the section on the lake. It was titled, The Hemlock Point Community Waterway. They had literally rebranded my lake. The text spoke of shared access, of community maintenance fees, and of rules governing boat speeds and docking procedures. It was written with the absolute conviction that the lake was their collective property. It was pure fantasy, a legal fan fiction they had all agreed to believe. Then I reread my deed. Arthur, my lawyer, had been right. The language was ironclad. The parcel was defined not just by its boundaries, but by its purpose as a reserve. The key clause, the one that Arthur had marveled at, stated that the owner of the parcel held sole and absolute riparian stewardship, control, and authority over the entirety of the body of water known as Hemlock Point Lake, inclusive of the water column, the lake bed, and all access thereto. It didn't just give me the land under the lake, it gave me the water itself. It was a level of ownership so total, so archaic it was almost feudal. The original owners hadn't just wanted to sell a plot of land. They had wanted to ensure that whoever owned this sanctuary could protect it from the outside world. I picked up my phone and called Arthur. Arthur, I said, it started. I explained the late-night visit from Brenda and her husband, the welcome basket, and the phantom bylaws. I expected him to be concerned. Instead, I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. Well, he said, that didn't take long. Brenda, you say? Oh, I'm familiar. Her reputation precedes her. She runs that HOA like her own personal fiefdom. They seem to think they own my lake. Arthur. They've had the privilege of using it for 20 years without a landlord, he replied, his voice turning serious. They've mistaken a privilege for a right. It's a common and dangerous assumption. So what's our play? My architect brain, the part that loves order and systems, kicked in. I want to be methodical, I said. I don't want a shouting match on the shoreline. I want to build a case. I want to establish a clear, documented record of my ownership and their trespass. Excellent, Arthur said. That's exactly right. No emotion, just facts. The law is on our side, but a clean paper trail makes the victory quicker and less expensive. So here's what you do. First, you will respond to any communication they send you in writing. You will be polite, formal, and you will state facts. You will not acknowledge the authority of their HOA or their bylaws in any way. You will simply state that the land and the lake are private property. Send every piece of correspondence to me. Second, start a log. Document every unauthorized entry, Every boat that crosses onto your side of the lake. Every conversation. Dates, times, names if you can get them. Third, and this is the important part for now, do not be aggressive but be firm. You need to visibly and legally assert your ownership. The first official salvo from the HOA arrived 3 days later via certified mail, a classic intimidation tactic. It was a letter from Brenda, on thick, creamy letterhead embossed with the Evergreen Vistas logo. It informed me that I was in violation of 3 separate community covenants. Violation 1, construction of an unapproved outbuilding. My cabin. Violation 2, failure to adhere to the community's natural color palette. Apparently, the beautiful cedar of my cabin was not an approved shade of nature. Violation 3, erection of an unauthorized private dock structure. This referred to a small floating platform I had anchored a few feet from shore, just big enough for a chair and a fishing rod. The letter stated that I had 30 days to remedy these violations, which included submitting my cabin's blueprints for architectural review and removing my non-compliant dock. It ended with a thinly veiled threat about fines and further legal action. Following Arthur's advice, I drafted a response. It was short, professional, and brutally to the point. Dear Miss from Brenda's last names, it read, "Thank you for your letter dated date. For the purpose of clarification, the property located at parcel number, my parcel number, which includes the entirety of Hemlock Point Lake, is a private reserve and is not, nor has it ever been, affiliated with the Evergreen Vistas Homeowners Association. As such, the covenants and bylaws of your association do not apply to my property. All structures and activities thereon are in accordance with my rights as the legal owner. I trust this resolves any confusion. Sincerely, my name." I sent it via certified mail and CC'd Arthur. It felt like launching a perfectly coded counter routine. No emotion, just logic. The response was silence, for about a week. But the activity on the lake changed. The boats from Evergreen Vistas became bolder. A large pontoon boat, loaded with at least a dozen people, motored right up to my side of the lake, dropping anchor not 50 yards from my porch. They cranked up a radio, the bass thumping across the water, and proceeded to have a loud, raucous party. They were staring at my cabin, laughing, making a spectacle. It was a deliberate act of intimidation, a floating middle finger. I sat on my porch, took a photo with a telephoto lens, and wrote down the time and date in my new log. This was their next move, psychological warfare. I wasn't going to engage, but I was going to follow Arthur's advice. It was time to visibly assert my ownership. I spent that afternoon online, and with a few clicks I purchased a dozen large, highly visible buoys. On each one in clear block letters were 2 words, private property. The buoys arrived a few days later, stacked in large cardboard boxes that I hauled down to my little floating dock. They were bright orange, obnoxiously so, and about the size of a watermelon. The lettering was black, stark, and impossible to miss. I spent an entire afternoon in my canoe, a map of the lake on my lap, methodically placing them. I wasn't just scattering them randomly. My architect's mind took over again. I was creating a system. The original survey map showed the precise property line, which, as it was defined by the lake's shoreline, was effectively the high water mark on my side. But the deed granted me the entire lake. The question was, how do you mark a boundary on water? I decided on a line of demarcation. I paddled out to what I judged to be the midway point of the lake, a straight line running from the northernmost inlet to the southernmost cove. It was a generous line, still leaving the Evergreen Vistas residents with a vast open area of water in front of their docks. But it established a clear visual border. One by one, I attached a concrete anchor to each buoy and dropped it into the water. The orange markers bobbed on the surface, a perfect, unwavering line. Plunk, plunk, plunk. Each one was a small declaration. This side is mine. This is the boundary. Do not cross. The effect was immediate and, from my perspective, deeply satisfying. It was like an invisible electric fence had been switched on. The boat traffic from Evergreen Vistas, which had been brazenly cutting across the entire lake, now stayed conspicuously on their side of the orange line. I could see them through my binoculars. Pontoon boats slowing down and turning, speedboats making wide, respectful arcs, jet skis buzzing like angry hornets but never daring to cross the barrier. They would get close, stare at the buoys, point, and then retreat. The message was received. The reaction from the HOA, however, was less about quiet respect and more about simmering rage. 2 days after my buoy wall went up, another certified letter arrived. This one was dripping with legalistic jargon. It cited maritime navigation laws, public waterway access statutes, and a litany of other impressive-sounding but entirely irrelevant regulations. It accused me of creating a navigational hazard and illegally obstructing a community waterway. It demanded the immediate removal of the unauthorized buoys. It was signed, not just by Brenda, but by the entire HOA board. They were escalating, trying to bury me in a blizzard of official-looking paper. I forwarded the letter to Arthur. His response was an email with the subject line, "Adorable." He explained, "They are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. None of this applies. A privately owned lake is not a public navigable waterway in the eyes of the state. It's the legal equivalent of you telling them they can't park their car in your living room. They're trying to scare you into thinking your living room is a public highway." He drafted another response for me, even more blunt than the last. It cited the specific state statutes that defined private versus public bodies of water and politely informed them that my placement of private property markers within the boundaries of my own real estate was perfectly legal. Any further correspondence on this matter, he concluded the letter, should be directed to my legal counsel, followed by his name and office address. This was a critical step. It moved the conflict from a neighborhood dispute to a formal legal matter. It was a clear signal. The time for letters and veiled threats is over. From now on, you should talk to my lawyer. I thought that might be the end of it. I thought they would finally consult their own lawyer, who would surely tell them they were standing on legal quicksand. I was wrong. I underestimated Brenda's ego. She wasn't just a president. She was a queen, and my very existence was a challenge to her reign. The next escalation was more direct. I woke up one morning to find 3 of my new buoys were gone. Not just drifted away, but gone. I got in my canoe and paddled out. The anchor ropes on all 3 had been cleanly cut. A cold fury, different from the hot anger I'd felt before, settled in my gut. This was no longer just trespassing. This was destruction of property. This was a deliberate criminal act. I took photos of the severed ropes, documented the date and time in my log, and called the local sheriff's department. I reported the vandalism. An older deputy came out, a man with a weathered face and tired eyes. He listened patiently, looked at my photos, and stared out at the lake. "I'll be honest with you," he said, sighing. "Down here we call these neighbor disputes. You say they cut your lines. They'll say they never touched them. Without a witness or a camera, it's your word against theirs. There's not much I can do besides file a report." He was right, and I knew it. But filing the report was part of the plan. It was another piece of the paper trail. It officially documented their escalating aggression. Brenda was trying to bait me into a confrontation, into doing something rash. I was not going to give her the satisfaction. That evening, I ordered 2 things online. The first was a set of high-end, weatherproof night vision security cameras. The second was something a bit more substantial. I had been planning to build a proper dock eventually, a place to moor a small fishing boat and maybe a couple of kayaks. I decided to accelerate that plan, but I wasn't going to build a dock that matched their flimsy composite plastic piers. I was going to build a fortress. I contacted the same father and son crew who built my cabin and told them what I wanted. A permanent, deep pylon pier, driven into the lake bed with a large T-shaped platform at the end. It would be a major, undeniable, and permanent statement of ownership. While the cameras would catch them in the act, the pier would be an act of defiance they couldn't ignore, cut, or steal in the middle of the night. It would be a monument to my resolve, built of pressure-treated timber and galvanized steel. The war was escalating, and I was preparing to fortify my position. The construction of the pier was an operation designed for maximum visibility. The crew arrived with a small barge carrying a pile driver, a piece of equipment that announced its presence with a thunderous, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that echoed across the entire valley. For a week, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, the sound of steel posts being driven deep into the lake bed became the new soundtrack of Hemlock Point. I have to admit, I enjoyed it. Each concussive blow felt like a nail in the coffin of Brenda's delusions. I could see the residents of Evergreen Vistas standing on their pristine lawns, arms crossed, staring across the water at the source of the noise. The construction was a legal, permitted, and very loud assertion of my rights. While the crew worked, I installed the security cameras. I wasn't subtle about it. I mounted them high on the trunks of several tall pine trees overlooking the shoreline and the new pier. They were aimed not at the houses across the lake, which could have been construed as an invasion of privacy, but squarely at the water itself, my water. They covered the line of buoys, my floating dock, and the entire perimeter of the new pier construction. Each camera had a small, blinking red light, a clear and constant reminder that they were being watched. The pier itself was a thing of beauty, a piece of functional architecture that was both rustic and imposing. It was solid, unyielding, and completely over-engineered for my needs. It stretched 100 feet out into the lake, ending in a platform large enough to host a small party. It was a declaration in wood and steel. The day it was finished, I paid the crew, and the blessed silence returned, now punctuated by the presence of this new, unmovable structure. The combination of the pier and the cameras seemed to work. For a few weeks, an uneasy peace settled over the lake. The boats stayed on their side. No more buoys disappeared. I received no more certified letters. I started to think maybe, just maybe, they had finally given up. They had seen my resolve, seen the cameras, heard the pile driver, and realized they were fighting a losing battle. The quiet was wonderful. I bought a small aluminum fishing boat with a quiet electric motor and spent my mornings on the lake, casting for bass. I was finally living the dream I had set out to achieve. The conflict felt like it was receding into the past, a bad memory. Then came the 4th of July, Independence Day. The irony was not lost on me. I had invited a few old friends from the city up for a quiet barbecue on my new pier. It was a perfect summer evening. The sun was setting, the grill was smoking, and the lake was calm. As dusk fell, the fireworks began. Not my fireworks, I hadn't bought any, but a massive professional-grade display launched from a barge anchored on the Evergreen Vistas side of the lake. It was clearly a community-funded event. Rockets screamed into the air, exploding in brilliant chrysanthemums of red, white, and blue. It was beautiful, and for a moment I felt a sense of shared community. We were all just people enjoying a light show. But then the flotilla started. A procession of boats, pontoon boats, ski boats, even a few kayaks, decorated with glowing lights and patriotic flags, pulled away from their docks. They weren't just cruising on their side. They were heading directly for the center of the lake, forming a large celebratory fleet. And then, as if on some prearranged signal, the lead boat, a large and obnoxious vessel I recognized as belonging to Brenda's family, crossed my line of buoys. Then a second boat followed, and a third. Within minutes, my half of the lake was filled with a dozen boats, all blaring music, their occupants shouting and cheering. They weren't just crossing the line. They were flaunting it. They circled my new pier, pointing and laughing. Someone on Brenda's boat had a megaphone. "Happy 4th of July, neighbor." A voice boomed, dripping with sarcasm. "Thanks for letting us use your lake for our party." The laughter echoed across the water. My friends looked at me, confused and alarmed. The quiet barbecue was ruined. This was a coordinated, premeditated act of mass defiance. It was a public humiliation ritual. They were telling me that my buoys meant nothing, my pier meant nothing, my letters meant nothing. They were an army and I was one person. They believed they could do whatever they wanted through sheer force of numbers. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I pushed it down. I looked at the blinking red lights on my cameras. Every boat, every face, every jeer was being recorded in crystal clear high definition. I smiled, a thin, cold smile. "It's all right," I told my friends. "Let them have their little party. They've just given me the greatest gift I could have asked for." The next morning, after my friends had left, I downloaded the footage from the security cameras. It was even better than I had hoped. The low-light performance was superb. You could clearly see Brenda on her boat, raising a glass in a mock toast towards my cabin. You could see the boat registration numbers. You could hear the taunts from the megaphone. It was a comprehensive, undeniable record of a coordinated trespass. I saved the files to a secure hard drive and uploaded a copy to a private cloud server. Then I called Arthur. "I've got them," I said, and my voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. "I have video of at least a dozen boats led by Brenda, deliberately crossing onto my property for a planned event. I have audio of them mocking my ownership. It's all on camera." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Arthur let out a long, slow whistle. Well, he said. "Happy Independence Day indeed. It seems the HOA has just declared its own glorious, ill-advised, and beautifully documented independence from common sense. This is it. This is the casus belli. This is the ball game." The psychological warfare was over. The documentation phase was complete. Now the real battle was about to begin. Arthur's advice was swift and decisive. Do not engage. Do not confront them. Do not even look at them. From this moment on, you are a ghost. Let them wonder what you are planning. The footage is our ace, and we don't play it until the pot is big enough. The next step, he explained, was to move from defense to offense. We had established my ownership. We had documented their trespass and vandalism. and now we had irrefutable proof of a coordinated, community-wide violation. The next phase was not about the lake itself, but about the very entity that was orchestrating the harassment. The Evergreen Vistas Homeowners Association. Arthur spent a week buried in county records, corporate filings, and state registration documents. He was no longer just my property lawyer. He was a corporate investigator, and the HOA was his target. He emerged from his research with a triumphant tone in his voice. "They're a house of cards," he told me over the phone. The Evergreen Vistas HOA is registered as a nonprofit corporation in this state. That gives them certain benefits, but it also binds them to a strict set of rules. They have a fiduciary duty to their members. They are legally prohibited from acting in a way that exposes the corporation to significant financial or legal liability. And that, my friend, is exactly what Brenda has been doing. He explained the strategy. We were going to send one final, formal communication. Not a letter to Brenda, but a legal notice addressed to every single member of the HOA Board of Directors, delivered to their individual homes via a process server. This was no longer about a neighborly dispute. This was about corporate malfeasance. The notice, Arthur explained, would be a litigation hold letter. It would formally state that we were in possession of evidence demonstrating that the HOA, under their direction, had engaged in a pattern of illegal activity, including trespassing and destruction of property, and that we were preparing to file a lawsuit against the HOA as a corporate entity. The key, Arthur emphasized, was the target of the lawsuit. Suing Brenda as an individual would be messy and personal. Suing the HOA itself was a direct attack on the wallets of every single homeowner in Evergreen Vistas. The HOA has liability insurance, Arthur said, but their policy almost certainly has a clause that voids coverage for intentional criminal acts directed by the board. Once their insurance carrier sees our evidence, they'll drop them like a hot rock. That means any judgment we win would have to be paid out of the HOA's operating funds, or worse, through a special assessment levied on every single homeowner. We're going to make Brenda's little war incredibly expensive for everyone else. A week later, a very serious-looking man in a suit visited each of the 5 board members' homes and personally served them with the notice. The effect was like dropping a wolf into a sheep pen. The uneasy quiet I'd been enjoying was shattered, replaced by something new, panic. I could see it from my porch. There were cars driving between the massive houses at all hours. There were hushed, frantic conversations on driveways. I imagined the phone lines between the 5 board members were melting. They had been happy to play along with Brenda's game when it was just about intimidating a new neighbor. Now they had a legal document with their own names on it, holding them personally accountable for corporate misconduct and threatening a lawsuit that could cost their community hundreds of thousands of dollars. Brenda's power was derived from her ability to bully and control, but that power was only effective as long as her followers felt safe. Arthur had just shown them that following Brenda was the most dangerous thing they could do. 2 days after the notices were served, a new car appeared in the driveway of Brenda's house. It was a late-model Mercedes, the kind favored by expensive lawyers. A meeting was clearly being held. The next day, Arthur received a call. It was from a lawyer representing the Evergreen Vistas HOA. He was a lot more reasonable than Brenda, Arthur told me. He didn't bluster or threaten. He just wanted to know what our demands were. "And what did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him we were still assessing the full scope of the damages and that we would be in touch," Arthur replied with a laugh. "Let them stew. Let the board members sweat. Let the residents start asking questions about why their HOA fees might be about to skyrocket to pay for a lawsuit. Let Brenda try to explain this to her own people." The balance of power had shifted completely. For months, they had been the aggressors, and I had been the one reacting. Now they were the ones waiting by the phone, desperate to know what I was going to do next. The silence from my side of the lake was no longer a sign of weakness, but a source of terror for them. They had no idea what was coming, and their imaginations were surely running wild. The beautiful thing was, I didn't know what was coming next either. I had put my faith in Arthur's methodical, systematic approach. He had built a legal case with the same precision I would use to design a software system. Every piece was in place. Every variable was accounted for. And now he was about to hit execute. I just had to sit back and watch it run. The call came a week later. It was Arthur. "They blinked," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Their lawyer called me again. "The board is in full-blown panic mode. The other members have apparently turned on Brenda, demanding to know how she let this happen. The lawyer wants to arrange a settlement meeting. He wants to know what it will take to make this go away. So what do we ask for?" I said, my mind racing through possibilities. Fines? A public apology? Oh, we're not going to ask for anything, Arthur said, his tone turning steely. We are going to tell them the terms of our agreement. This is not a negotiation. This is a surrender. Theirs, not ours. I want you to think about what you truly want. Not just to win, but what does the perfect outcome look like for you for the rest of your life on that lake? I thought about it for a long time. I walked out onto my pier and looked across the water at the silent monolithic houses. What did I want? I didn't want their money. The lawsuit was a tool, not a goal. I didn't want a hollow apology. What I wanted was what I had come here for in the first place. Peace. Absolute, permanent, unshakable peace. I wanted to know that I would never have to deal with this again. I wanted to pull the weed out by its roots. I called Arthur back. I know what I want, I said. And it's not money. I laid out the plan. It was audacious. It was extreme. And Arthur was silent for a full 10 seconds after I finished. Then he let out a low, appreciative laugh. My God, he said. You're a ruthless man. It's beautiful. It's legally sound. It's directly tied to the source of the conflict. And it's something they would never, ever see coming. They're expecting a financial penalty. You're going for something so much more valuable. The meeting was set for the following week at Arthur's office, a neutral ground. The HOA's lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Mr. Thompson, was there, along with the entire 5-member board of the Evergreen Vistas HOA. Brenda was there, of course. She sat at the head of their side of the long conference table, her face a stony mask of defiance, but her eyes darted around nervously. The other 4 board members wouldn't look at her. They looked tired, stressed, and angry. Arthur began the meeting. He was a master of legal theater. He didn't raise his voice. He simply and calmly laid out the facts, starting with my purchase of the land, the clear and absolute language of the deed, and my initial attempts at polite clarification. Then he moved on to the HOA's response. The threatening letters, the bylaws from a fantasy world, the destruction of my property, and then he came to the 4th of July. And that, he said, turning to a large monitor on the wall, brings us to this. He hit a button on his keyboard. The crystal-clear night vision footage filled the screen. The conference room was silent except for the sound of the taunts from the video. We watched in high definition as Brenda's boat led the charge across the line of buoys. We saw her raise her glass in a mocking toast. We heard the man with the megaphone. Arthur let the video play for a full 5 minutes, a highlight reel of their coordinated trespass. When he turned it off, the faces of the 4 other board members were pale. Mr. Thompson, the lawyer, just stared at the table, slowly shaking his head. Brenda, for the first time, looked genuinely shaken. That video, Arthur said quietly, along with sworn testimony from my client's guests in the prior police report for vandalism, forms the basis of our impending lawsuit against the Evergreen Vistas Homeowners Association, a lawsuit for damages including, but not limited to, property damage, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We will also be seeking punitive damages based on the coordinated and malicious nature of the trespass. Furthermore, we will be filing a formal complaint with the state's Attorney General's office, petitioning them to review the corporate status of the HOA based on the board's reckless and intentional exposure of the non-profit corporation to massive legal liability. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. However, he continued, my client is a man who values his peace and quiet. He is not interested in years of litigation. He is prepared to offer you a one-time, non-negotiable settlement to make this entire matter disappear. Mr. Thompson looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. What are your terms? He asked. The terms are not financial, Arthur said, enjoying the moment. He slid 5 copies of a document across the table. My client's primary concern is the lake. His deed grants him sole and absolute stewardship and control of the entire body of water. The HOA's mistaken belief that they have a right to use this water is the root of this entire conflict. Therefore, the conflict can only be permanently resolved by addressing that root cause. Mr. Thompson picked up the document and began to read. His eyes widened. He read it again, as if he couldn't believe the words on the page. Brenda snatched a copy and her face went from white to a deep, blotchy red. This is insane, she hissed. This is extortion. The other board members were reading their copies, their expressions a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. Arthur looked at me. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time for the final move. It was time for the call that would change everything. The call to the police. Brenda, I said, speaking for the first time in the meeting. my voice calm and even. "I think you have a visitor." At that exact moment, two uniformed police officers walked into the conference room. The arrival of the officers sucked all the air out of the room. Their presence was a physical manifestation of how far things had escalated beyond a simple neighborhood tiff. One of the officers was the same young, tight-jawed man who had first responded to Brenda's call weeks ago. He looked at me, then at Brenda, and a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He held a warrant in his hand. "Brenda last name?" he asked, his voice formal and devoid of emotion. She just stared at him, speechless. "You are under arrest for coordinating a criminal trespass and for the willful destruction of private property." The second officer stepped behind her and asked her to stand up. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the dead silent room. The other board members looked like they had seen a ghost. This was real. This wasn't a threat of a lawsuit anymore. This was a criminal proceeding. As they led a sputtering, furious Brenda out of the conference room, Arthur calmly addressed the remaining shell-shocked board members and their lawyer. "My client," he said, gesturing to me, "filed a criminal complaint last week supported by the video evidence you just saw and the previous report of vandalism. He specifically requested the warrant not be served until this meeting, so you could all be present to witness the consequences of your former president's actions." He let that sink in. He was showing them the carrot and the stick simultaneously. They had just seen the stick. Now for the carrot. "The settlement offer on the table is your only way out of this," Arthur continued. "If you refuse, my client will proceed with the civil lawsuit against the HOA. The video evidence will be made public. Your insurance will drop you, and every homeowner in Evergreen Vistas will be paying for this mess for years. And I assure you, after seeing that video, a jury will be very, very generous to my client." Mr. Thompson, the lawyer, finally found his voice. He looked at the settlement agreement, then at the four remaining board members. "Advise them," Arthur said simply. Thompson cleared his throat. "My legal advice," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "is to sign the agreement. Sign it now." The core of the settlement was simple and brutal. I wasn't asking for money. I was asking for the lake, forever. The agreement stipulated that the Evergreen Vistas HOA would, on behalf of all its members, formally and permanently relinquish any and all claims, perceived or otherwise, to the use of Hemlock Point Lake. They would legally acknowledge my sole and absolute stewardship. But here was the masterstroke, the part I had conceived on my peer. In exchange for me dropping the lawsuit, the HOA would agree to sell me a 5-foot wide strip of land that ran along the entire length of their shoreline. It was the land their pristine lawn sloped down to, the land that held their retaining walls, and most importantly, the land where every single one of their expensive identical docks was anchored. The purchase price would be $1. By owning that 5-foot buffer, I would not only own the lake but also the very land they needed to access it. Their docks would be trespassing on my new property. They would be legally and physically cut off. The agreement stipulated that they would have 90 days to remove all of their docks and any other personal property from my newly acquired land and from the lake's surface. After that, any remaining structures would be considered abandoned, and I would have the right to remove them myself at their expense. It was a complete and total victory. The four board members, looking like men signing a surrender on a battleship, picked up their pens and one by one signed the documents. The war was over. I had won. The aftermath was swift. Brenda was charged, and the video evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer advised her to plead guilty to lesser misdemeanor charges to avoid a felony conviction. She received a hefty fine and probation, but the real punishment was social. She was forced to resign as HOA president in disgrace. Her reign was over. The news of the settlement spread through Evergreen Vistas like a shockwave. I became the bogeyman, the monster who had stolen their lake. But beneath the anger, there was a grudging understanding. They knew they had been led into a disaster by an arrogant leader. Within a week, the first dock was dismantled. Then another. For the next 3 months, I sat on my porch and watched, day by day, as the perfect uniform shoreline of Evergreen Vistas was unmade. Crews came and unbolted the composite piers, loading them onto trucks. The retaining walls now marked the edge of their property, with a 5-foot strip of no man's land, my land, separating them from the water. The lake became quiet, truly quiet. The roar of speedboats was replaced by the gentle lapping of water against my shore. The distant sound of party music was gone, replaced by the call of a loon. It was everything I had ever wanted. The lake was mine. Not in a possessive, gloating way, but in a protective, custodial way. It was a true reserve now, a sanctuary shielded from the noise and entitlement of the world next door. I had come seeking peace, and after a long and unexpected war, I had finally truly found it.